In the autumn of 1888, a phantom haunted the gaslit alleys of London's Whitechapel. A brutal butcher who preyed on the city's most vulnerable, leaving a trail of terror and gore. He was known only by his infamous name, Jack the Ripper. At the very same time across the city, the British royal family sat at the apex of the world's greatest empire, a symbol of power, prestige, and moral duty. On the surface, these two worlds could not have been further apart. But what if they weren't? What if the Ripper's terrifying secret was not one of poverty and madness, but of privilege and power? What if the killer wasn't some unknown monster lurking in the slums, but the man who was second in line to the British throne? His name was Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence. To history, he is known as Eddie. Queen Victoria's grandson, a man often described as dull, listless, and a profound disappointment to the monarchy. He was hardly the picture of a cold-blooded murderer, and yet for over a century, his name has been whispered in connection to the most notorious murder spree of all time. Today we open the case file on one of history's most outrageous accusations. Did the future King of England stalk the streets as Jack the Ripper? Welcome to Cursed Chambers. To even begin to unpack that outrageous question, to connect the most famous royal family on Earth with its most infamous serial killer, you first have to understand the city where this theory was born. London in the late 19th century wasn't one single city. It was two separate planets occupying the same space, colliding in a smog-filled, gaslit universe of extreme contrasts. To understand our story, you have to understand these two worlds. First, let's journey to the West End, the world of palaces, power, and prestige. This is the gilded cage of our primary subject, Prince Albert Victor, Christian, Edward, Duke of Clarence, and Avondale, known to his family, and eventually to history, simply as Eddie. Who was Eddie? He was the eldest son of the Prince of Wales, the future King, Edward VII, and the grandson of the formidable Queen Victoria herself. He was second in line to the throne of the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. From the moment he was born, his destiny was mapped out. He would one day be King of the United Kingdom and Emperor of India. The weight of an entire empire rested on his future. The problem was, Eddie seemed uniquely unsuited to bear that weight. If the royal gene pool were a high-stakes game of poker, Eddie was dealt a rather disappointing hand. While his father was a charismatic worldly bon vivant, and his grandmother a titan of political will, Eddie was, well, Eddie. By all contemporary accounts, he was a gentle and kind-hearted man, but he was also famously languid, apathetic, and intellectually, let's be charitable and say, uncurious. He was the royal equivalent of that one person in a group project who has a famous last name and contributes nothing yet, is guaranteed to get the same top grade as everyone else. His tutors despaired. He drifted through his naval and army careers without distinction. He was known more for his impeccably tailored suits and the precise angle of his hat than for any grasp of politics or statecraft. He was, in short, a profound disappointment. For Queen Victoria, who valued duty above all else, her heir presumptive was a constant source of low-grade anxiety. He was a beautiful, priceless vase that everyone was terrified would get knocked over. And the vase, it turned out, was already cracked. Because behind the dull public persona, Eddie's private life was a minefield of potential scandals. In 1889, London was rocked by the Cleveland Street scandal. Police raided a male brothel on Cleveland Street, uncovering a list of prominent aristocratic clients. In the frantic cover-up that followed, whispers began to circulate that one of the clients was none other than Prince Eddie himself. To this day, his direct involvement has never been proven. But the damage was done. The incident demonstrated two crucial things to the public. First, that there were dark sexual secrets being kept behind the respectable facade of the aristocracy. And second, that the authorities, including the police and the government, were willing to orchestrate massive cover-ups to protect the powerful. The prince's name was now permanently linked in the public imagination with secrets vice and the establishment's willingness to bury the truth. He was no longer just a dullard, he was a liability. A walking, talking PR crisis for the crown. This was the state of Prince Eddie in 1888, a gentle, aimless young man trapped by his destiny, trailed by rumors and under immense pressure from his family to finally marry a suitable princess who might fix him. He was a prince in a palace, but a prisoner nonetheless. Now take a carriage just a few miles east from the manicured parks and grand squares of Westminster. Cross a border not of geography, but of reality. As the air grows thick with the smell of coal smoke, cheap gin, and human desperation, you fall into another universe entirely. Welcome to Whitechapel. If Eddie's world was a gilded cage, Whitechapel was an open sewer. This was the dark, pulsating heart of London's East End, a place where the Industrial Revolution had dumped its human refuse. It was a labyrinth of poverty, a maze of over 200 intersecting unlit alleyways, courts, and passages, many of them unnamed and unmapped. This was a place you could get lost in. This was a place where a person could simply disappear. The fog here, a thick yellow pea souper, smog, a toxic cocktail of sea mist and industrial pollution, was so dense it could choke you. Its muffled sound blinded the eye and provided the perfect cloak for anyone who wished to move unseen. Through this gloom, the gaslights cast a sickly theatrical glow on endless rows of dark brick tenements, overflowing with families living 10 to a room. The poverty was absolute. This was the world of sweatshops, of casual dock labor, of children with rickets and old men coughing their lungs out from bronchitis. For thousands of women, survival meant a desperate nightly gamble. They were known as the unfortunates women who would sell their bodies for just a few pennies, the price of a stale loaf of bread, a glass of gin to numb the cold, or most critically, the price of a bed in a common lodging house for the night. To fail to earn those few pennies meant spending the night on the cold, damp pavement, exposed and utterly vulnerable. This was the world Jack the Ripper chose as his hunting ground. His victims were not chosen at random. They were chosen because they were the most disposable people in Victorian society. They lived on the margins, moved without notice, and their disappearances often went unreported for days. They were women whose desperate need for a client forced them to walk off into the dark with a complete stranger. So you have these two worlds separated by just a few miles, but by an entire universe of experience. On one side, a prince haunted by scandal and the crushing weight of expectation, his every move scrutinized. On the other, a district of ghosts, a place of profound despair where the forgotten and the damned walked the earth. In the autumn of 1888, a nightmare would be born from the poverty of one world, and its shadow incredibly would stretch for over a century to fall upon the privilege of the other. The stage was set. The terror was about to begin. The nightmare began, as they so often do, not with a grand declaration, but with a grim discovery in the cold, pre-dawn hours of East London. In the gutter of a dark street called Bucks Row, a local cart driver found the body of a woman. Her name was Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly. She was 43 years old. At first, it looked like just another tragic but sadly unremarkable death in Whitechapel. But when the examining doctor looked closer, he discovered the horrific nature of her injuries. Her throat had been cut twice so deeply that she was nearly decapitated, and her abdomen was slashed with a series of brutal, jagged wounds. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was the work of a different kind of monster. See. The press reported on the murder with a shudder of morbid excitement, but it was still seen as an isolated, if unusually savage act. And as London's poorest residents began to eye the shadows with a new sense of dread, where was our potential future king, Prince Eddie? He was doing what any respectable aristocrat did at the end of August, enjoying the start of the grouse shooting season. He was visiting a viscount in Yorkshire, spending his days on the moors in a world of tweed shotguns and blissful ignorance. While one part of his future kingdom was beginning to grapple with a new kind of terror, the other was primarily concerned with how many birds they could bag for dinner. The contrast could not have been more stark. Just 8 days later, the monster struck again. In the backyard of a tenement building on Hanbury Street, the body of 47-year-old Annie Chapman was found. The savagery had escalated. Her throat was cut in the same brutal fashion, but this time her abdomen had been sliced open and her uterus had been surgically removed from her body. This was the murder that lit the fuse. The idea of a lone madman stalking the streets was no longer a grim possibility. It was a terrifying fact. The press went into a frenzy, coining a new term for the killer's hunting ground, the Autumn of Terror. The police were baffled, chasing phantoms and false leads. Panic began to grip the city. Meanwhile, Prince Eddie's holiday was over. He had returned to his military duties as an officer in the 10th Hussars, stationed at the cavalry barracks in Hounslow, West London. His life was the polar opposite of the chaos unfolding in Whitechapel. It was a world of rigid, mind-numbing routine. His days were a choreographed procession of morning parades, weapons inspections, regimental dinners, and trying to look deeply interested while a senior officer explained something terribly important about battlefield tactics. It was a life of immense privilege, but almost zero personal freedom. His schedule was accounted for, his movements were tracked, and his companions were carefully chosen. He was in his own way a prisoner, not of a stone tower, but of royal protocol. Then, at the end of September, the killer delivered his masterpiece. This was the night that would forever cement the legend of Jack the Ripper. In the early hours of September 30th, he managed to kill not one, but 2 women in less than an hour. This was the double event. First, Elizabeth Stride was found in a dark yard, her throat cut. It's believed the killer was interrupted during the act as her body was not mutilated. But he was not finished. Less than an hour later, and only a few streets away, the body of Catherine Eddowes was discovered in Mitre Square. This time, he had not been interrupted. Her mutilations were extensive and horrific. Her uterus and one of her kidneys had been removed and taken by the killer. The city went into lockdown. The idea that a killer could strike with such precision and audacity twice in one night in the heart of the city and then melt back into the fog was inconceivable. He seemed to be a demon, a phantom who could be anywhere and everywhere at once. He was no longer just a murderer, he was a legend, a boogeyman. And it was around this time that the police received the first of many letters, this one taunting them with a chilling sign-off. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. The name was born. Now, while Jack the Ripper was having his busiest and most infamous night on the job, Prince Eddie was having what was almost certainly his most boring. And this is the part of the story where the grand conspiracy theory begins to wobble like a loose wheel on a carriage. Because on the night of the double event, Prince Albert Victor was not in London. He wasn't even in England. He was over 400 miles away in the remote, windswept highlands of Scotland, staying at Balmoral Castle as a guest of his grandmother, Queen Victoria herself. It's hard to imagine a more solid alibi. He was surrounded by the Queen of England, the royal household visiting German royalty and government ministers. His presence is documented in court circulars, letters, and newspaper reports. To believe that he somehow slipped away from the most famous woman in the world, traveled secretly and at impossible speed to London, committed 2 brutal murders, and was back in Scotland in time for breakfast without anyone noticing. Well, it stretches credibility past the breaking point. It's the historical equivalent of claiming the suspect couldn't have robbed the bank because he was busy having tea with the Pope. As alibis go, it's about as good as it gets. But the terror in London wasn't over. On November 9th, Jack the Ripper performed his grand, horrifying finale. This time, he took his victim indoors. Mary Jane Kelly, a young woman of 25, was murdered in her small, single-room apartment on Miller's Court. Because he was behind a locked-door safe from interruption, the killer had all the time in the world. The scene discovered by the police the next morning was something out of a literal nightmare, a sight so grotesque that even seasoned, hardened officers were physically ill. Mary Kelly's murder was the horrifying climax of the Autumn of Terror, and then silence. Just as mysteriously as he had appeared, Jack the Ripper vanished. The murders stopped. The letters ceased. He melted back into the fog of history, leaving behind a city scarred by fear and a police force humiliated by its failure. While this real-life horror story reached its bloody conclusion, a very different manufactured royal fairy tale was just beginning for Prince Eddie. The pressure on him to marry had become immense. The monarchy needed to secure the next generation and, frankly, get Eddie's life in order. The Great Princess Hunt, as the press called it, was on. Palaces across Europe were scoured for a suitable Protestant bride who would be willing to take on the challenging task of being Eddie's wife. And so by the end of 1888, the two parallel nightmares had seemingly concluded. The Ripper was gone. The prince's future was being arranged. Two stories that on the surface never touched. But in the decades that followed, a dark and persistent theory would emerge, weaving these two narratives together into one incredible, scandalous accusation. The question we have to ask is, why? What made this dull, disappointing prince the perfect villain for a story he had no part in? And so we arrive at the central question, why? Why did the shadow of the world's most brutal serial killer fall upon a dim-witted, lethargic prince? With the real killer having vanished into the London fog, a vacuum was created. And history, like nature, abhors a vacuum. In the absence of a real culprit, a new one would have to be invented. And in the 20th century, a story emerged, a theory so detailed, so dramatic, and so scandalous that it has refused to die ever since. So let's put on our tinfoil hats for a moment. Let's not look at the historical record, but at the grand, sprawling, and utterly fantastic conspiracy theory itself. It's a story that, if it were true, would be the greatest cover-up in modern history. Our main source for this incredible narrative comes from a 1976 book by author Stephen Knight, titled Jack the Ripper: The Final Solution. It's a work of investigative journalism that reads more like a John le Carré spy novel. So pour yourself a stiff drink and let's dive into the rabbit hole. According to the theory, the story begins not with murder, but with love, or at least a secret royal affair. Prince Eddie, our wayward heir, supposedly fell in love with a pretty young and, most importantly, Roman Catholic shopgirl from the East End named Annie Elizabeth Crook. This wasn't just a fleeting dalliance. The theory claims that Eddie, in a fit of romantic rebellion, secretly married her. They even had a child together, a baby girl named Alice. This right here was a secret of catastrophic proportions. The heir to the Protestant throne of England, married to a Catholic commoner with an illegitimate, or, in Catholic eyes, legitimate child. If this news got out, it would shatter the monarchy and throw the line of succession into absolute chaos. The establishment had to contain it. But secrets have a way of getting out, and the person who knew everything was the baby's nanny, a young flame-haired woman named Mary Jane Kelly. Yes, that Mary Jane Kelly, the Ripper's final, most brutally murdered victim. Mary Kelly, according to the theory, was not just a simple prostitute. She was the keeper of the royal family's darkest secret. And being in desperate need of money, she decided to use it. She confided in three of her friends, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, and Elizabeth Stride, and together they hatched a plan to blackmail the government. They threatened to expose Prince Eddie's secret family to the world. The threat reached the highest levels of power. It landed on the desk of the Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury. He in turn consulted the very top Queen Victoria herself. a decision was made. The scandal could not be allowed to break. The women had to be silenced permanently. But you can't just send a government agent to deal with something like this. You need a deniable operation. You need someone with a very particular set of skills. Enter the Queen's own physician, the eminent and highly respected Sir William Gull. Here, the theory takes its darkest turn. Sir William Gull, according to Stephen Knight, was not just a doctor, he was also a high-ranking Freemason. And he was tasked with carrying out the final solution. He was to hunt down and eliminate the 4 women who threatened the crown. He was Jack the Ripper. The theory posits that Gull did not act alone. He was driven around in a carriage by a coachman named John Netley. Together, they stalked the streets of Whitechapel. The brutal mutilations inflicted on the victims were not the work of a deranged madman, but cold, precise, and symbolic acts. They were allegedly Masonic ritual punishments, warnings to other secret keepers about the penalty for betrayal. The removal of Catherine Edhouse's kidney wasn't a random act of savagery. It was a specific Masonic sign. The whole operation was supposedly protected by the head of the London Metropolitan Police, Sir Charles Warren, who was, you guessed it, also a high-ranking Freemason. The police weren't failing to catch the Ripper, they were actively helping him get away with it. It's a fantastic story, isn't it? It's got everything: a secret royal baby, a tragic love affair, blackmail, a shadowy cabal of powerful men in aprons, and a clear, concise solution to the most baffling murder case of all time. It would make a brilliant movie. It has only one tiny, insignificant microscopic flaw. Almost none of it is true. All right, let's take off the tinfoil hats and put on our detective fedoras. It's time to look at the facts. And the facts, I'm afraid, are a bit of a buzzkill for conspiracy lovers. Let's start with the silver bullet, the absolute cornerstone of the debunking. The one thing no conspiracy theory can survive: a rock-solid, verifiable alibi. As we touched on in Part 3, the first rule of accusing someone of being a serial killer is to make sure they were actually in the same city when the murders were happening. On the night of September 30th, 1888, when Jack the Ripper killed 2 women in 1 hour, Prince Eddie's location is known. He was at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, chilling with his grandma, the Queen. Court circulars, newspaper reports, and royal diaries all confirm it. Unless Prince Eddie had access to a teleportation device not yet known to science, he simply could not have been in Whitechapel. Case closed on that front. But wait, the theorists cry. It wasn't Eddie, it was Sir William Gull. Okay, let's look at suspect number 2, the 71-year-old doctor. Sir William Gull was indeed a real and famous physician. However, in 1887, the year before the murders, he had suffered a severe stroke that left him partially paralyzed and in frail health. The idea that this elderly, infirm man was somehow able to overpower murder and brutally mutilate 5 women in dark alleys, often hoisting their bodies into position to perform complex removals of organs, is not just improbable. It's medically absurd. He simply did not have the physical capacity. So where did this incredibly detailed story even come from? Stephen Knight based his entire book on the testimony of a man named Joseph Gorman, who claimed to be the illegitimate son of Walter Sickert, a famous artist, and the secret royal baby's daughter. So, he was claiming to be Prince Eddie's great-grandson. His story was essentially family folklore passed down to him, with no verifiable evidence, no documents, no proof whatsoever. It was just a story he had been told. And it was a story that changed and became more elaborate over time, with Gorman even retracting parts of it later on. The entire foundation of this grand conspiracy rests on the unproven and frankly unbelievable testimony of one man. As for the Masonic connection, it's the oldest trick in the conspiracy theory playbook. When in doubt, blame a secret society. Experts on both the Ripper case and Freemasonry have systematically dismantled the idea that the killings had anything to do with Masonic ritual. It was a classic case of seeing patterns where none exist. So we are left with a theory that is, to put it politely, complete and utter nonsense. But that brings us to the real question, the more interesting question. If the theory is so demonstrably false, why has it endured for so long? And why was Prince Eddie a man who couldn't have possibly been the killer, the perfect scapegoat? The answer lies in what was true about his life. He was a source of anxiety for the monarchy. He was trailed by whispers of scandal. The Cleveland Street affair did prove that the establishment was willing to engage in cover-ups to protect its own. Eddie was a known quantity of royal dysfunction. He was the weak link in the imperial chain. This made him the perfect blank canvas. He was famous enough to be a shocking suspect, but his character was seen as so weak and dissolute that it seemed plausible he could get caught up in some sordid mess. People didn't believe the theory because of the evidence. They believed it because it felt right. It confirmed their suspicions about a decadent and secretive aristocracy. The Ripper Prince theory provides a tidy, satisfying ending to an unsolved mystery. It gives us a villain with a face and a motive that is far more compelling than the likely truth. The grim reality is that Jack the Ripper was probably not a prince or a doctor. He was likely just an anonymous, pathetic, and forgotten man driven by a violent pathology we will never understand, who lived and died in the same squalor as his victims. And that is the real power of a good story. We would rather believe in a thrilling lie, a grand conspiracy of kings and masons, than accept a mundane and unsatisfying truth. The cursed chamber in this case isn't a real room in the tower. It's the chamber of secrets we build in our own minds, the one where the most exciting story always wins. So, the verdict is in. The case file can finally be closed. When you lay the flimsy, contradictory theory next to the cold, hard facts of the historical record, the conclusion is inescapable. The rock-solid alibi at Balmoral, the physical frailty of the supposed killer, Sir William Gull, the unreliable nature of the story's source, it all points in one direction. Prince Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence, was not Jack the Ripper. The entire grand conspiracy of a royal baby blackmail and Masonic assassins is a work of fiction, a fabrication, a historical ghost story. And that should be the end of it. But it isn't, is it? Because that brings us to the final and frankly most interesting question of all. If the entire theory is a house of cards built on a foundation of fantasy, why are we still talking about it more than a century later? Why does the ghost of the Ripper Prince refuse to die, stubbornly haunting the pages of history books and the dark corners of the internet? The answer, I think, tells us more about ourselves than it does about Prince Eddie. The endurance of this theory comes down to a few very powerful, very human truths. First, we humans are storytelling animals, and we absolutely hate a vacuum. The Jack the Ripper case is one of history's great gaping black holes. It's a mystery without a final chapter. We have the victims, we have the gruesome details, we have the city gripped by terror, but we have no ending. The killer was never caught, never identified. And that is deeply, profoundly unsatisfying. We are hardwired to seek patterns, to demand resolution. A story without an ending feels broken. Conspiracy theories rush in to fill that void. The Ripper Prince theory, for all its flaws, provides a complete, self-contained narrative. It gives us a killer, a motive, a method, and a cover-up. It provides a neat, tidy answer to a messy, unsolved question. It's the satisfying blockbuster movie ending compared to the frustrating, ambiguous ending of the real-life documentary. We often prefer the thrilling lie to the boring, incomplete truth. Second, the theory provides us with a much better cast of characters. Let's be honest about the grim reality. The real Jack the Ripper was likely some anonymous, pathetic nobody, a man whose name is lost to history, driven by a violent, incomprehensible madness, who lived and died in the same squalor as his victims. His story is just a bleak, depressing tale of mental illness and urban decay. But the conspiracy theory, now that is a story. It gives us a fallen prince, a secret baby, a ruthless prime minister, a formidable queen, and a shadowy cabal of powerful men, in aprons pulling the strings. It elevates a sordid tale of street crime into a high-stakes political thriller. It gives us villains we recognize figures of immense power, which makes the story feel grander and more significant. It's a narrative with stakes. We would rather imagine a conspiracy of kings than accept the banality of evil. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the theory's endurance is fueled by a timeless and deeply ingrained public distrust of the establishment. The idea that the rich and powerful are engaged in dark dealings behind closed doors and will use their influence to cover up their crimes is not a new one. It was true in 1888, and it remains a potent force today. And in this specific case, the public had good reason to be suspicious. The Cleveland Street scandal was real. It proved unequivocally that the government and the police were willing to bury scandals to protect the names of the aristocratic elite. That real-life cover-up provided the fertile soil in which the seed of the Ripper conspiracy could grow. It lent the whole fantastic story a veneer of plausibility. It made people think, well, if they would cover that up, why wouldn't they cover up a few murders to protect the heir to the throne? The theory taps into our inherent suspicion that the official story is never the whole story. And so we clear Prince Eddie's name of these fantastical crimes. He was not a monster. He was not Jack the Ripper. But to say he is blameless in his own story would be to ignore the real tragedy of his life. Because while he was innocent of murder, Prince Eddie's life was in its own way a profound failure. This was a man born into a role he was completely and utterly unsuited for. He was a prince who possessed none of the qualities his position demanded. He lacked intelligence, ambition, and a sense of duty. He was a disappointment to his formidable grandmother, a headache for the government, and a blank slate for the press to project their anxieties upon. His actual end was as undignified as his life. He didn't die in a grand battle or in some political intrigue. He died at the age of 28 from influenza, a victim of the global pandemic that swept the world in the early 1890s. And, in a final cynical twist of fate, his death was seen by many in the halls of power as a stroke of good luck. It was a providential event that conveniently removed a weak link from the line of succession, paving the way for his much more stable, capable, and respectable younger brother George to eventually become king. Eddie's death in a way solved a problem for the monarchy, and that is the real, less sensational tragedy of Prince Eddie. The cursed chamber he inhabited wasn't a dark alley in Whitechapel. It was the gilded cage of his own life, a life of immense privilege but crushing expectation. He is cursed by history not for what he did, but for what he was, a profound disappointment. His legacy is so faint, his character so ill-defined, that it was easily hijacked, twisted, and rewritten into a monstrous fiction. He is remembered today not as the man who could have been king, but as the man who was against all evidence accused of being a monster. And that, perhaps, is the most damning royal tragedy of all. Thank you for joining us in this particular cursed chamber. Let us know in the comments what you think, and if there are other historical conspiracies you'd like us to investigate. Until next time, keep questioning the official story. Joan, dua, biko, the joy nhak o jai. Kupart, 3, depart, 4, end.